Greta Thorne did not weep. She stood at the mantelpiece in the yellow-papered bedroom with the gold locket open in her palm. The one Hortense had placed in her hands the evening before the wedding, and called a gift, called a welcome into the family, called proof that Greta was one of them now. She looked at it for a long moment. Not with anger, not with grief. With the quiet, clean recognition of a woman who has finally stopped pretending she did not know what she knew. She closed the locket. She set it on the mantelpiece, in the center, where it would be found immediately and understood immediately, and she turned away from it without hesitation. She packed only what had always been hers. Her father's satchel, the flat, battered thing he had carried through every newsroom from Baltimore to Savannah, was already waiting at the foot of the wardrobe, because some part of her had known, even in the weeks leading up to this moment, that she might need it. She filled it now with the things that belonged to the life she intended to build. 3 journals of her own writing, a bound set of her father's letters to his editors, a small folded note with the name and address of a man in Philadelphia who had once said, years ago over supper, that Greta had the clearest editorial instincts of anyone he'd put a galley proof in front of. She had kept that note at the bottom of the satchel since the day she received it, like a door she hadn't decided to open yet. She changed into her traveling dress. She did not look at the wedding photograph on the bureau. She walked down the servants' staircase and out through the kitchen garden and into the Virginia dark. And she did not look back at Thorne House as she went. She had been 24 when she married Emmett Thorne. Her father had died the previous winter, leaving her the satchel, a drafting table, a stack of manuscripts no one had agreed to publish, and a moderate reputation in the printing trade that meant nothing in the parlors of Richmond. She was not without resources. There was a small annuity from a great-aunt. But she was alone in a way that was becoming, with each passing month, a social inconvenience. Her father's friends were kind, their wives were kinder. Their kindness had an edge to it that cut more cleanly than any cruelty. Emmett Thorne was 31. He owned 2,000 acres of tobacco land south of Richmond and a house that had been in the family since before the war. He was not unkind. That had been the first thing anyone told her about him, and it remained true throughout the 14 months of their courtship and into the marriage itself. He was not unkind. He asked after her health. He remembered that she preferred her coffee without sugar. When she had gone to Richmond in December to meet with her father's former publisher, Emmett had arranged the coach without being asked. He was also never quite present. That was the thing she had noticed, and then steadily, deliberately, stopped noticing. There was always a portion of him located somewhere else, in the figures on his desk, in the conversation he was about to have, rather than the one he was having. He listened to her in the way that good, responsible men listen. He retained what she said and could repeat it back. But something in the receiving of it went no further than his memory. It did not reach whatever part of a person changes when they have truly heard something. She had told herself that was enough. That respect was a foundation. That warmth could grow in time if the ground was tended. She had believed it because believing it was easier than the alternative. That she was walking, eyes open, into a life that had no place in it for the specific person she actually was. She had not meant to overhear them. It was the first Friday of March, and Emmett had his business partner, a man named Caraway, in the front study. Greta had come down the hall intending to return a book to the library shelf. The study door was not fully closed. She had been going to knock. She had raised her hand. She manages it all well, Emmett was saying. His voice was measured, cordial, the voice he used for boardrooms and invoicing disputes. The household runs, the social obligations are met. She's a competent woman. But, Caraway said. A pause, not long enough. There isn't a but, Emmett said. She's a competent woman. I needed a stable household. That's the whole of it. Greta lowered her hand. She did not move for a moment. She stood in the hall with her hand at her side, and the book still under her arm, and felt, not the devastation she might have expected, not the crumbling sensation of the ground giving way. What she felt was recognition. The specific, sober recognition of a woman who has suspected something for a long time, and has now simply been given the facts. She was a competent woman. He needed a stable household. That was the whole of it. She went upstairs. She sat on the edge of the bed. She waited, in the honest way she had always waited when something difficult arrived, for the grief to come. It did come. But it was not what she had feared. It was quieter and more specific. The grief of a person who has carried something carefully for a long time, who has brought her whole self into a space and arranged it as beautifully as she could. and discovered that the space was not built for what she brought. Not because it was wrong. Because no one had ever intended it to hold her. She sat with that for a while. Then she got up and went to the wardrobe. The train to Philadelphia took 9 hours. Greta sat in the window seat with her satchel on her lap and watched Virginia give way to Maryland, and Maryland give way to Pennsylvania. And somewhere in the middle of that, somewhere between the flat tidewater dark and the first gray hills, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of what she had chosen. Not the loss of Emmett, exactly, if she was honest. And she intended, from this point forward, to be relentlessly honest. She had not loved him in the way that rewrites a person. She had tried. She had brought everything she had to the trying. The loss was different and more specific than heartbreak. It was the loss of a year and a half of effort that had never been acknowledged as effort. The loss of a self she had carefully folded down to fit a space that had never actually needed her in it. She let herself feel it, then she folded it away, deliberately. She had work to do. The offices of the Weekly Clarion occupied the second floor of a building on Chestnut Street that smelled of ink and pine resin, and something beneath both of those things that Greta recognized immediately. The smell of a working press, the particular mineral sharpness of lead type, just set and paper just run. She had grown up with that smell. It was the smell of her father's hands when he came home late. Mr. Aldous Fulton, she saw the sign on the door, Fulton A.H., editor and publisher, was smaller than she remembered from the supper party 4 years ago where she'd first met him. He was perhaps 65, with thick-lensed spectacles perched at the end of his nose, that he pushed up with one knuckle when he recognized her standing in his doorway. Mrs. Thorne, he said, then corrected himself. Greta. Just Greta is fine, she said. He looked at her. At the satchel. At the fact that she had appeared alone in his offices on a Monday morning, with no trunk and no companion and no letter of introduction, only the flat assurance of a woman who has made a decision and seen it through to its first stage. Your father's note, he said at last. My father's note, she agreed. He studied her for a moment with the considered attention of a man who has spent 40 years deciding which writers were worth the paper. Then he stepped back from the door. The galleys for Wednesday's edition need proofing, he said. I'll want your first corrections by noon. My eyes aren't what they were. She came in. In the weeks that followed, Greta learned the particular shape of the Clarion, the way she had always learned things. Methodically, with the full attention of a person who understands that attention is the first tool and the most important one. Fulton had been running the paper for 20 years and had grown in the last 5 both prouder and more tired. He let her proof the galleys. Within a week, he let her rewrite a society column that had come in flat. Within 2 weeks, he had started handing her the difficult letters, the ones from readers who had grievances, the ones from advertisers who had complaints. Because, as he put it one evening while she was resetting a headline, she had a way of saying hard things plainly without making them land like blows. Your father always said you had a journalist instincts, he told her. I told him I didn't believe him. Women's instincts and journalists' instincts are different animals. She looked up from the type. I told him that, Fulton said, and he told me I was a fool. I think he was right. She almost smiled. She went back to the type. Back in Richmond, the silence Greta had left behind was louder than Emmett had anticipated. Hortense found the locket first. She had come to call on Greta at 8 in the morning and found only the empty bedroom, the wardrobe standing half cleared, and the locket on the mantelpiece, positioned with a precision that could not be mistaken for forgetfulness. She stood in the doorway for a long moment. Then she called for Mrs. Carew, the housekeeper, and asked if anyone had seen Mrs. Thorne that morning. No one had. Emmett was in the study with his account books when Hortense came to find him. She told him what she had found. She placed the locket in his hand. He looked at it lying there, small, gold, heavier than it looked, and said nothing for a long moment. Something was happening in him that he did not have a ready category for. Not simply the inconvenience of an absent wife, not simply the social problem of a vanished Mrs. Thorne. Something more unsettling. The particular disquiet of a man who has casually described a person to another person, in a casual voice, with the assumption that the description was accurate, and is now confronted with the possibility that he did not know the person well enough to describe her at all. He had called her competent. She was, but he had said it the way you describe a good piece of furniture, and she had heard him. He understood that now with a clarity that had not been available to him before she was gone. She had been in the hall and heard him reduce 14 months of a marriage, 14 months of a person who had done her considerable best to make something real in that house, to a tidy arrangement in a business conversation. He set the locket on his desk. He looked at it for a long time. "There will be talk," his mother said. "Yes." "What will you say?" "The truth," he said, "as much of it as I know." May was 9 years old and had never once in her life been described as simple. She was Emmett's niece, his late sister's daughter, and she lived at Thorne House under Hortense's management, which meant she was well-fed, well-dressed, and thoroughly watched over, but not always well listened to. Greta had listened to her from the first afternoon, had sat with her in the back parlor and read to her from a copy of Tom Sawyer she'd found on the library shelf, and had answered her questions about trains, about printing presses, about why newspapers had to have 2 columns and not 3, with the specific, unhurried attention that a child recognizes immediately and never forgets. May had adored Greta with the wholehearted and decisive admiration of a 9-year-old who has made up her mind about a person and sees no reason to revise the conclusion. 3 weeks after Greta disappeared, May found Emmett sitting at his desk in the evening, staring at nothing in particular. "You're going to find her, aren't you?" she said from the doorway. Emmett looked up. "May." "Philadelphia," May said. She talked about Philadelphia. Her father worked there. She said if she ever had the chance to do real writing, that's where she'd go. She paused. "I'm 9, not stupid." He looked at his niece, who watched everything and kept her own counsel, and had apparently been holding this information quietly, in case someone decided to be sensible enough to ask for it. "Are you going to write to her?" May said. He was quiet. He picked up a pen. He put it down. "I don't know what to say." May looked at him with the expression she reserved for adults who said things she found insufficient. "That's not a real reason." He did not have a good answer for that. She waited a moment, decided he wasn't going to produce one, and left him to it. He wrote the letter that night. He wrote it 3 times before he was satisfied with none of them, and sent the second version anyway. Because the third was more eloquent, and the second was more honest, and he had made himself a promise to prefer honest over eloquent going forward. The letter arrived at the Weekly Clarion on a Thursday morning. Greta found it when she came in from setting the Wednesday corrections. She stood at the compositing table and read it standing up. It was not long. It was not elegant. It started and stopped in places where she could feel that he had started and stopped himself. But it was honest, genuinely honest, the kind that sounds different from performed honesty, because it doesn't flow smoothly, it catches on the truth in places and has to back up and try again. He said he understood what she had heard in the hall. He said he had not known, until she was gone, what he had actually been saying. He said he was not writing to ask her to return. He was writing because silence had become unbearable, and he had begun to understand that he had made a habit of the easiest available road, and this was the first small step off it. The last line said, "I would like to know that you are well. That is all I am asking. You owe me nothing." Greta read it twice. Then she folded it and went back to the galleys. That evening, after Fulton had gone home, she sat at the small table in the back room and wrote a reply. She told him she was well. She told him the work suited her in a way nothing had suited her since her father's press. She did not tell him she had read his letter 4 times. She sealed it and set it with the Morning Post. The letters became a rhythm. They were different from the conversations they had managed over 14 months of marriage. In those conversations they had been 2 people conducting themselves correctly in each other's presence. The letters were something else. He told her things he seemed to have no one else to tell, about a tenant dispute that had gone better than expected, because he had listened first instead of deciding first. About a book that had bothered him in ways he couldn't articulate, and then articulated them at length anyway. About May, who had apparently been operating a small printing enterprise in the carriage house, using his old hand press, which no one had known about until she produced a 4-line broadsheet with a drawing of a horse. Greta wrote about the Clarion, about a piece she was developing on the women employed in Philadelphia's textile mills, and what access to medical care they lacked. About Fulton, who had started calling her the real editor about 6 weeks in and only slightly as a joke. She also wrote, in the 6th letter, something she had not planned to write. Something she had been turning over since leaving Richmond. "I want to be honest with you about something, because I am finding that honesty is the only habit worth keeping. I knew, before I overheard you in that hall, that something was wrong. I had known it for months. I told myself I was choosing wisely and being practical, and some of that was true. But some of it was simply easier than admitting that I was walking into a life that was not built for me, and that I had decided being needed was close enough to being seen. That was my mistake too. I'm not saying this to make you feel better. I'm saying it because I want you to know that I am not a woman who stood only in your hall, without also standing in my own and choosing poorly. He wrote back within 4 days. I read that 3 times. I don't know what to do with the generosity of it except to try to deserve it. She kept that letter in the same drawer where she kept her father's letters. She did not analyze why. In October, May got sick. It started simply, a cold, a cough, the ordinary small ailments of a child who has been outdoors in the first week of autumn rain. By the 4th day the cough had deepened and the fever had not broken. By the 6th, the doctor Hortense had summoned was speaking to Emmett in the hallway, with the measured care of a man who has passed through concerned and arrived somewhere more serious. Emmett sat with May through 2 nights. He held her hand. He read her the newspaper and let her argue with the editorial judgments, which she did even at a fever of 102. You should go get Greta, May said on the 7th morning, in the scratchy voice of someone who has been coughing since Wednesday. She'd know what to do. A pause. Also, I want to tell her about the broadsheet. He looked at his niece, small and too pale and entirely herself, even reduced by fever, still with opinions, still taking up her particular space in the world, and felt the specific fear that comes with watching someone self-sufficient become fragile. He had not understood until this moment how much he had relied on May's competence, the same way he had relied on Greta's. The way you rely on everything that seems self-sufficient, without asking yourself what it costs. He had a letter on the outgoing post to Philadelphia that afternoon. He himself followed it by 2 days. Greta was at the compositor's desk when he came through the door of the Clarion office. She had a galley sheet in one hand and a pencil in the other. She looked up at the sound of the door and went very still. He had 2 days of travel on him. His coat was road-worn, and his face showed the particular set of a man who has been frightened for a week and has been managing it by moving forward. May, it was not a question. Fever, 7 days, deepening cough. He said it directly, the necessary facts first, the way she had always appreciated. I came to ask your professional judgment. Sit down, she said. Tell me everything from the beginning. He sat. He told her. She listened with her whole body still, her pencil moving in short economical notes at the edge of the galley sheet, all her attention gathered inward. When he finished, she looked up. How quickly can you get a coach arranged for tomorrow morning? He blinked. By 6. Good. She was already moving toward the shelf. There are specific compresses I want to bring, and I'd rather compound them here tonight than try to source the ingredients in Richmond. The cough is the thing I'm thinking about. Greta, he said. She paused. Thank you, he said. I know this isn't something you owe me. She looked at him over her shoulder. Her expression was not warm, and it was not cold. It was direct. I'm not doing it for you, she said. I'm doing it for May. She has been writing me letters about broadsheet since August. The least I can do is show up when she needs someone. He was very still. She wrote to you? 6 letters. She has opinions about headline spacing. She turned back to the shelf. I'll have what I need ready by 5. Go find somewhere to sleep. She came to Richmond. She sat with May for 5 days. Brought the compounds she had spent the night preparing, made May take them 3 times daily without complaint, and read her the editorial correspondence from the Clarion as bedtime entertainment, which May found superior to fiction, on the grounds that real people were more interesting than invented ones. By the 4th day the cough broke. May noticed it before anyone said anything and looked at Greta, with the expression of a child who has been proved right about something she was always going to be proved right about. You came, May said. I came, Greta agreed. Emmett went to get you. May settled against the pillow. He's different, you know. Since you left, he listens now. Last week he asked me what I thought about a headline, and then actually waited to hear the answer. She paused. He never used to wait for answers about headlines. Greta said nothing, but she was listening in the way she listened to things that mattered, with her full body present, not managing her expression. I'm not asking you to do anything, May said. I just wanted you to know. Thank you for telling me, Greta said. May sighed the sigh of a 9-year-old who has said what she came to say and finds adult Sloane's mildly exhausting. You're still making me take the medicine 2 more days after I feel better, aren't you? Absolutely. Fine, May said and closed her eyes. Emmett found Greta in the garden on the morning of the 5th day. She was sitting on the low stone wall with her notebook open. She looked up when she heard him. She did not look surprised. She looked like a person who had been waiting to have a particular conversation and was now prepared for it. He sat down a few feet away. He had decided that preparation was less important than honesty, and that he should simply say the true things in the order they arrived. "I called you competent," he said. "Yes." "I said it the way I would describe a piece of equipment." "Yes." He was quiet a moment. "I had spent 14 months in a marriage with a person who was genuinely, specifically remarkable, and I had arranged my understanding of her so that she fit into the life I already had, rather than looking at my life and asking whether it was adequate to who she was." He paused. "That was not wisdom. That was the most manageable version of things, and I preferred manageable to true." She looked at him. "I'm not asking you to come back to Thorne House," he said. "I'm not asking you to change anything you've built. I am asking for something smaller." He met her gaze steadily. "I want the right to demonstrate, over time, by actions, not by argument or grand statement, just by showing you, consistently, that I understand the difference between needing something useful and choosing someone specific." Greta was quiet for a long moment. "I told you in my 6th letter," she said finally, "that I had made my own mistakes, that I had chosen poorly and called it being practical." "I remember." "I'm not absolved of that. I was also a woman who knew something was missing and chose to continue anyway because the alternative required more honesty than I was prepared for." She held his gaze. "I want you to know I understand that. This was not only your failure." He looked at her. Something in his face shifted. Not dramatically, not the way it happens in stories. Quietly. "The work," she said. "The Clarion. Fulton is speaking about retiring by next spring. The paper would become mine to run. That is not a small thing. That is the whole of what I'm building, and any future I consider has to be built around it, not instead of it." "I know," he said. "Greta, your work is not a complication. It is the thing. It is the thing about you I understood last and should have understood first." She looked at him for a long time. She was doing what she always did when she was deciding something important. Holding it in her full attention, turning it over, looking at the structure beneath the surface. "All right," she said at last, "a chance. Demonstrated by actions, over time, not a guarantee." "God, no," he said. "I know better than to ask you for a guarantee." Something that was almost a smile moved across her face. "Good," she said. "Then we understand each other." She opened her notebook. She began to write. He sat beside her on the wall and did not say anything else, because he had finally learned, at significant cost, through significant loss, that the most important thing a person can do sometimes is simply stay and be quiet and let someone else occupy their own space in their own time. The Weekly Clarion became Greta's in the spring of the following year. Fulton signed the papers at the small table in the back office, his steadier hand making careful work of the signature. And then he sat back and looked at what had been built. At the 2 handwritings on the assignment board. At the new column she had introduced for women's legal correspondence. At the stack of letters on her desk from mill women and shopkeepers and teachers who had written to say they had read something in the paper that had made them feel seen. "Your father knew," he said. "He usually did," Greta agreed. "He told me once, when you were maybe 16 and he had you running proofs, he said, 'That girl doesn't need teaching, she needs room.'" Fulton smiled briefly. "I told him that was no way to raise a journalist. He told me to mind my own business." A pause. "He was right. I'm telling you that now, so you can spend whatever time I have left being insufferably certain about it." She put her hand over his, briefly, on the table. He patted it once with the tact of a man who has decided sentimentality is acceptable in small and carefully managed doses. Then he asked whether the spring issue's lead story was going to make someone important angry, which had become his primary criterion for whether a story was worth running. She told him it was going to make several people very angry. He said good and got up to make the tea. Emmett came to Philadelphia in April. He had read her piece on the textile workers, the one she had been researching for 7 months, the one that had been picked up by 2 larger papers and had resulted in a city council hearing. And he had written her a letter that said only, "I had to read it twice to understand all of it. The 3rd time I read it, just because I wanted to. I don't think I've ever done that with a newspaper before." She had written back, "That is possibly the best thing anyone has said to me about my work." He arrived on a Tuesday. He stood in the middle of the newsroom and looked at it, at the press, at the organized shelves, at the board covered in story ideas in 2 different handwritings, at the framed broadsheet on the wall that May had made, and that Greta had put behind glass and hung at eye level where it could be seen. And something in his face was different from anything she had seen before. Not managed, not arranged, simply there. They had dinner on Walnut Street, at a restaurant she had chosen, where she knew the owner, and no one looked twice at a woman who arrived and ordered for herself. He asked about the council hearing. She told him the parts that had worked and the parts that hadn't, and what she intended to try next. He listened without interrupting and asked, at the end, whether she had considered pursuing it as a series rather than a single story. She had. She told him that. "You've already thought of everything I might suggest," he said. "Usually," she said, "but I like that you suggested it." He looked at her across the table. Something settled between them. Not cinematic, not dramatic, quieter than that. The particular quality of 2 people who have been through enough honesty together to stop needing the performance of ease. "I would like to come back to Philadelphia," he said, "in a month, if you'd permit it." "I'd permit it," she said. "And in 2 months, and in 3. She set down her fork. She looked at him. "I am not a project," she said. "I am not a corrected mistake. I am a person who has built a life she is proud of and who is considering, very carefully, whether there is room in it for something more. That's all I'm considering. Do you understand that?" "I understand it," he said. "I'm not asking you to be anything other than exactly what you are. I'm asking whether there is room." He paused. "There doesn't have to be." She was quiet for a long moment. "There might be," she said. "Ask me again in 3 months." He accepted that. He did not push it further. He walked her back to the Clarion offices and said good night at the door and returned to his hotel, and she went upstairs to finish the morning's galley proofs. Somewhere in the middle of laying out the type for Wednesday's front page, she permitted herself to think, for the first time in a long time, that the shape of the future was not entirely known. Her father had told her, years ago, that the best stories were the ones you hadn't finished writing yet. She set the last piece of type in its row. She stepped back. She looked at the page. Then she went back to work.